Hello, welcome to the extra credits of Luca Guadagnino's Queer. I'm Trey.
And I'm Kelsi.
So, we're back talking about Luca. This is one of the most impressive filmmakers working today, one of our favorites. This year in 2024, he's made two very different movies, but two excellent films in his sports erotic thriller Challengers and now his romantic period piece Queer. And he's one of the most important directors working today, which is really nice as like Luca fans for him to finally be seen by the wider public in this way. I think he's going to be back in the news in the next 6 to 8 months with After the Hunt, which I believe is his next film. That's going to be starring Julia Roberts, Andrew Garfield, and Iowa Debary.
I'm so excited. Yeah, and we saw like Andrew Garfield just basically give like a trailer for the movie with his Golden Globes like moment.
Not even really promoting We Live in Time, just trying to be like sexy, and he succeeded.
I wish they cut to Luca at the Golden Globes so we could see the reaction. I bet he was like,
I bet he was like, I did that.
He was like, I got
that out of that. Got it out of him.
And we saw Io Debary like wearing the like old fit from Julia Roberts' previous Golden Globes outfit. You know, everything was connecting.
Yeah, and apparently Luca is on the way to remake American Psycho, which I was kind of like, I don't know how I feel about that. Of course, I'm down for Luca to make a new horror film. I think Suspiria is excellent, Bones and All, maybe even better. But American Psycho is already a really great film, and Christian Bale is wonderful in that movie. And then I saw it was going to be starring Austin Butler, and now those rumors are seemingly debunked about maybe it being Luca's project or debunked about Butler's, starring role in that movie. But regardless, Luca has a lot of unrealized possible projects down the line over the next few years that he has mentioned to reporters that he might make, because ultimately Luca is a spicy guy. Like he's always just putting his name out there that he's going to be directing the next movie or kind of being behind it, this next big project with these young actors, because he's smart. He understands that this industry will remember you, during award season, then forget you a few years later. So I'm excited for whatever he's got next, but I'm really excited to be talking about maybe one of the best movies of his filmography, which is a crazy thing to say, which is Queer. And I say it's a crazy thing to say because we are such massive fans of his filmography. Yeah,
and also because people were kind of like hot and cold on Queer. And I wonder how much that has to do with Challengers coming out earlier this year and Challengers being his most commercially, accessible movie.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a second. So Challengers is in this mold of like a Scorsese's Color of Money. Yeah. We did a 2.5 hour deep dive.
It's a great comp. That was one of my favorite pods too of the year that we've done.
Certainly one of my favorites. One of the most like listened to episodes from this past year in 2024. And I think it's because that movie was exciting. It did the Luca project, which is like looking at the human condition and making the sensual experiences of all of us cinematic in a really kind of big way that was considering like a mass appeal, that was trying to find something universal in the sensuality between these three characters. And I thought it was a really great like cinematic tease, this like fun romantic comedy sports thriller that some people took very seriously as like a masterpiece, which you could argue that in the sports genre, certainly. But I think as Luca fans, a part of us were like, this isn't like exactly one of his most thematically or narratively dense movies. Yeah. It isn't exactly a part of the larger Guadagnino project where the environment speaks to all the themes of his character studies. It was more so like, we're going to have a really good time for 2 hours, and this score is like unreal.
Yes.
And you're going to see some crazy cinematography.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I was wondering like how many people were introduced to Guadagnino's work through Challengers, which is amazing. Like, I love that. But I think people may have been surprised to go back to his other work and see kind of what you're talking about, like maybe things that were a little bit more thematically ambitious in something like A Bigger Splash, which is my favorite movie of his.
Yes.
We did a whole ranking on our Call Me By Your Name Patreon episode, which was really fun. And
we went back and forth a lot.
Kind of difficult because he has so many different things going on in his filmography, which I absolutely love. And which is why I also think he could crush like a Suspiria type of American Psycho because of what he did with Bones and All in particular. But yeah, so I'm excited to see what he does with After the Hunt. But I am really excited to talk about Queer, and I hope people revisit it if they didn't check it out because of maybe like reviews that it's been getting when After the Hunt comes out.
Yes. So Queer, I think, will certainly be re-examined over the next few years. I think it was polarizing because some found it to be flat. Some people walked out of the theater, critics and audiences, if you check Letterboxd, feeling pretty cold and distant from this movie. It is a $40 to $50 million art piece. I'm not sure how it got made. And I know people like, listeners, I'm sure you hear people in the movie spaces say that a lot. How did this movie get made? We need to celebrate it. I really do feel that about this film. Being a romantic period piece with like surreal imagery and nightmarish sequences with two incredibly amazing performances from Daniel Craig and Drew Starkey, and just a fun ensemble cast. It is like a really harrowing, tragic, but beautiful, poignant movie that I think is one of the most experimental films of 2024 as well. And so I found it to be like this transformative, like mid-budget experience, like something like Beau is Afraid from a few years ago that also cost $30 to $40 million, that was unafraid to play a little bit into absurdity, except Luca is a little bit more he's darker in more interesting ways sometimes than Ari Aster. Ari's a little bit darker in funnier ways sometimes.
Which I appreciate both, but
Yes. But I think, like, for example, we're about to talk about The Brutalist maybe later tonight or later this week, and that movie's getting a lot of the Oscar recognition, or like, I think, the nominations coming out soon, but people are expecting it to be nominated for Best Picture, maybe even win Best Picture, for being this massive epic, the epic that speaks to what maybe the movie landscape needs right now. And I thought Queer was already that. It just didn't get discussed as that. Though we will speak to the concerns of how and why people were distanced, because it doesn't seem to be like, we seem to be in the minority here of thinking that it's very good, if not great.
Yeah, I think you're a little higher on it than me in terms of like thinking that is it your favorite Guadagnino, or is it too soon to say?
I struggle by saying a 2024 release is the greatest, or recent release is a greatest movie of an auteur's filmography if they've been working for 20 to 30 years. But it's certainly in conversation with Call Me by Your Name. It's in conversation with I Am Love or A Bigger Splash. Those are my favorite Guadagnino projects. I think A Bigger Splash, I agree, has always been my number one Luca movie. I love recommending that movie to people. I think it's so much fun, especially considering the Ralph Fiennes love right now with the Oscar season and Conclave. I recommend people go and watch that film, or to a lesser degree because of what's going on with Madam Web with, I'm forgetting her name, who stars in Madam Web. Dakota Johnson, thank you. But she's very good in A Bigger Splash, so people should go watch that movie if you have not. I'm not going to say it's my favorite Luca movie right now, but I will say I think Queer is my favorite movie of 2024.
Okay,
which is pretty exciting.
So
I'm stoked to talk about it.
I loved it, but I'm excited to hear about why it is your favorite, because I'm surprised that you're higher on it than me, because I came out like really loving the movie. And I saw you check your phone a few times, and I brought that up to you at the end of the movie. You're like, I was just seeing kind of like how it was paced out. I was so impressed with like the pacing of it, which is what people were kind of out on. So I'm really fascinated to hear like how you felt about that, because that was the most distancing thing for people. But what I think and why I love the movie is I think it was distancing on purpose. But before we get into it, I love that you brought up Beau is Afraid, because similar to Aster, right? He wrote Beau is Afraid like before he did, or he was planning on doing it before he did Hereditary, before he did Midsummer. And it's what he had talked about in his press run, maybe one of his most personal projects. And you can tell like how much goes into Beau is Afraid, which we absolutely loved. But how
a masterpiece of the 2020s.
Themes from Hereditary that people loved and Midsummer that people loved, but they didn't love Beau is Afraid.
Right.
And I think it was his most ambitious project. With similar to Guadagnino's Queer, right? We have this as what Guadagnino is talking about on his press run, like maybe his most personal film, his story that he was thinking about making from a young age, right? And so it also, I think, in a similar way, the reason why it's so interesting and maybe one of my favorites of his filmography is because it does encapsulate or maybe achieves like certain parts, I guess certain themes that he tries to develop in his other films, but maybe because of the constraints of the story elements, can't fully grasp. And I feel like in Queer, he's able to really kind of like, almost it's like a culmination of a bunch of different themes he's done in like Bones and All, or Call Me by Your Name, or things that he's interested in. And so that's why I personally really enjoy Queer as like a Guadagnino film, knowing his work.
It's a lifelong, by the way, I have Appa on me now for those watching at home who are just looking at Kelsey. Sorry, this is our Shih Tzu. Appa, say hello. This is becoming like an every other episode thing where she cannot just watch us talk to a microphone for an hour. Yeah, I mean, this is a lifelong project for Guadagnino. This is not something he just randomly thought he would adapt a William S. Burroughs novel. This is something he's been thinking about for decades. I was so excited to hear about the fact that he was going to be able to adapt it. And I thought it was everything that he's been wanting to do. It's emotional, it's surreal, it's hypnotic, it's funny, it's provocative, it is strange, it's immersive. It's everything that I think Guadagnino wants cinema to do, which is to tell stories. Like he wants to use the tools of cinema to tell stories. He does not like exposition heavy dialogue, nor does any filmmaker, but some directors will cheat and use those kind of things where they fear, or studios fear audiences not understanding what's going on.
We need to spell this out for audiences.
And Queer is certainly one of those movies, and so is that novel, where it does feel like a studio would not give $40 to $50 million to a director to make it because they would be afraid it would be too distancing, which is why I'm so surprised that Luca did get this. I assume Challengers and its potential success in like being able to get Zendaya on board was MGM, Amazon being like, okay, we'll let you have Queer.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was a part of his contract to do Challengers in the first place. I can't imagine it's accidental, coincidental that both these movies came out in the same year. So yeah, it is a really exciting movie. I recommend people to watch it. And when Kelsi said I was checking my phone, I'm not like just,
Not like the whole time. I saw you do it just twice.
Well, I just want to make it clear. I was checking my phone because I knew people wouldn't like the pace of this film. And I wanted to know when I felt the pace, though I was fascinated by the structure, when people would go, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And there was a couple moments, usually going into the second act, that I want to ask you about.
Okay.
So that was the no spoiler section of Luca Guadagnino's Queer. We're about to jump into the spoiler section. The last thing I'll say, for those of you who haven't seen this movie yet and you want to continue listening, I recommend just like streaming this week. If you need more just like free advertising for why you should go see Queer, Drew Starkey. Daniel Craig is really good in this, and we're going to talk about him. Definitely. And there have been some critics who are out on Drew Starkey's performance in this, or lack of a performance in terms of the way the criticism has been directed at him. Yeah. I disagree. When you're watching Daniel Craig walk through a 1950s Mexico City in this movie, and you're watching him in slow motion, and Nirvana's Come As You Are starts playing, and he locks eyes with Drew Starkey, and the camera is like in love with Starkey's face, and you as the audience are starting to elevate because we're falling in love with him too. You're like, what is going on right now? Is this like the next coming of a young, like, I don't know, Jude Law from Talented Mr. Ripley?
Yeah.
Like, who is this guy?
Yeah. Guadagnino really knows how to, or he has a good like team for casting, but he also has a really good like eye for like, starting Timothée Chalamet's career.
Yes.
And I think that was the only time we really talked during the movie, or just communicated, right? Non-verbally.
You're right.
Because I didn't really know what you had thought throughout the whole movie, which, by the way, we were in a packed theater. It was a really like cool experience.
Yeah.
And then
we had to sit in the front row. Except it was one of those indie theaters where you just walk in, hoping you can find a good seat.
Yeah. So yeah, we did sit in the front row, but for a pretty long movie. But anyway, the one time that we just like communicated non-verbally was when we first saw Drew Starkey, and I just like reached out to you.
Yeah, we did
like, Yeah. Hold on a second. Because I just think like, also we'll talk about how Luca, what he's doing in terms of like using the camera in this movie.
Yeah.
And observing Drew Starkey and like the point of view of this movie. But I think genuinely that Drew Starkey is like a star. I mean,
and he's a babe. Like, I mean, that's a part of it. Like, he knows the camera is in love with him. Like, that's a hard thing to do as an actor when you're asked to be this kind of subdued, everything is internal, there's not a lot expressed, and you have to kind of act as if you're being mysterious, like with your emotions, and not being able to, like, you're withholding so much while also being like the main romantic interest of the movie. You basically have to be a drug personified, and that's really challenging. And I do think that was the intent from Guadagnino. He wanted Drew Starkey's character Allerton to feel like you, the audience, were taking a drug, and I think that was really effective. So the camera work and the editing, the cinematography, it all does Starkey's performance justice. I just don't think he's getting enough credit. I think we both agree. Considering we were both, having like a spiritual experience.
I think, and also, in terms of like Drew Starkey, I think you're right. Like, I've heard people say that he wasn't like really doing anything because that was a part of like how his character was written.
Sure.
But I think you're totally right. Like him withholding was doing so much. And also like
And
when
his
we
glances.
say, yeah. And also when we say like, you know, he is going to be a star, we've talked a lot about, especially like with Glenn Powell conversations, like we're not talking about like, let's return to movie stars or anything like that. But it's more so like, oh, I didn't realize that he is like a performer, especially when I watched him on the Harris Dickinson, like actor on actor
That was a good one.
conversation.
Yeah.
And I had never seen Outer Banks or anything, which I know, people maybe know him from.
Right.
But,
Starkey from, yeah.
Yeah, Starkey. But I just like didn't know from that conversation that like he could do this. Like he just seemed, he has that like quality as an actor to keep a presence and be able to do something totally different in terms of this like reserved, really like
quiet charisma.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
Loud charisma usually wins out. It's Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it's really challenging for somebody to be
but
like a
it's not
wallflower.
like a cheesy way, do you know?
Yeah.
Which is like normally how it comes across. So
Yeah.
anyway.
I just like how
We're
much
fans.
we are. And I just like how much he kind of knows it. Like that's the funny part. And Luca knows it. Like Luca talks about himself sometimes leaning too much into voyeurism.
Yeah.
And he just like loves, you know, Bertolucci and Hitchcock. And so like that's just the way he shoots, you know, his actors as if they are also like these celebrities that people know and he knows. And so he wants to like basically make documentaries about his actors while also shooting his characters within the narrative that he's playing into. And so it's really cool to see that he is like, I know I can make this guy a superstar.
Yeah.
And I'm going to shoot him like he is a young Brad Pitt. Like
with the actors on actor conversation with like Harris Dickinson being such a huge kind of like, I think like he's someone who's known, right?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
And he's being cast in a lot of things. I actually think that Drew Starkey might.
It's a great take.
Yeah, like
maybe he should have been a Baby Girl.
Yeah,
it would have been interesting.
Yes,
that would
like
have been an interesting swap.
I think he would have maybe given a better performance. And I'm not trying to like say, you know,
I like Dickinson.
I like
good.
him too.
Triangle of Sadness, he's very good in that.
Yeah, and he does this kind of like, you know, specific kind of like bratty, almost like it's almost like what we will talk about in The Brutalist, like Joe Allerton and Nicholas Hoult, or I'm sorry, but Joe Alwyn, Nicholas Hoult, and Harris Dickinson are kind of being cast in like all these similar roles of being like this kind of like bratty, like
man,
you know what I mean, like
almost man-child sometimes,
overly confident, like of taking advantage of their privilege. And but I think Drew Starkey has something like he's able to do something like more serious. Than like, and I'm just thinking of Harris Dickinson just because they had that conversation. But anyway, I think like he could maybe eat his lunch.
I'm excited for his career. Okay, spoilers. Queer is adapted from William S. Burroughs' unfinished novel, which I think I said at the top. Guadagnino is no stranger to adaptations. He's not really tethered to the source text, but he does love what he loves in art. And so he will come back to stories or movies that he appreciates, and he wants to remake them with his stamp of approval, which I think is cool. Like Suspiria, for example, or even Bones and All with the novel, and then maybe American Psycho in the future. He usually tries to find an essence of an original text, and I think he does that here with the Burroughs novel, where he kind of reimagines it through his lens and his style. But I think he also holds himself to new standards. We see a new subgenre of the Guadagnino project here, because I think for the first time in Luca's career, maybe Suspiria comes closest, Luca really embraces artifice in a transparent way to the audience. Like when we're watching this world being built on a soundstage in Queer, where you can tell hundreds of artists worked on creating, painting, designing this dreamlike artificial 1950s Mexico City with two men kind of like unraveling in this one major narrative. And you're seeing these large matte paintings and these miniatures and these kind of cutaway scenes between major scenes. You're just kind of, I mean, for me at least, I was in awe. I was like, this is like actually movie making.
Yeah.
And as somebody who doesn't mind being immersed into like the gritty underworld of like the Batman, of like a Matt Reeves movie, which is always the example I use, I like being immersed into fantastical worlds. I like being immersed into digital worlds. I like watching David Fincher movies, The Killer, that are seemingly in the real world, but everything is like a digital composite. Yeah. I appreciate all those forms and styles of filmmaking, but there was something really refreshing about last year with Asteroid City from Wes Anderson.
Yeah.
And then this year with Luca Guadagnino's Queer, or at least 2 years ago with Asteroid City. I'm forgetting when that came out.
Yeah.
They felt very similar to me because I think the emotionality in both films is actually in the artifice that is really successful for Luca here. I just didn't know he had this in his bag or that he was interested in doing this at all.
Yeah. I mean, he talked about like the kind of like Powell and Pressburger influence of creating almost a set that felt artificial, like you're talking about, like in Asteroid City, that's used for a humorous effect, obviously, like with Wes Anderson that he does in his other movies as well, with miniatures, or even like aspects of something like the Grand Budapest Hotel. But when you see it in a Luca film, I think that is also something that maybe people were like, okay, I'm in a movie where the character and the writing is purposely distancing because the character, it's almost like a mystery, or it's the aspects of his life and what he is going through, like emotionally, and with this other character that he's interested in, Drew Starkey's character, it's unraveling, right?
Yeah.
And so then also when you put on top of that the kind of like artifice or the kind of like musical set design, that might also put people at a further distance. And so for me, I think it worked similar to what you're talking about with Anderson's project, or even like Barbie or something, right? How like Greta Gerwig talked about like creating dream ballets like through this artifice, which was also a musical. But I mean, I think that Queer really works for me, at least in the production design, because we have surreal elements. We have almost like, these nightmarish sequences.
There's Lynchian things going on. There's images that will remind you of a Cronenberg film. Like, it is a very strange movie in how it jumps between tones and this structure of the narrative where it has 3 separate chapters. But yeah, I think all that to say, I was just impressed to see somebody elevate the standards or the expectations of their own work. Yeah. Because Luca does have a stamp, like within film circles. Like people know a Luca movie, even if it's in a different subgenre that he doesn't traditionally play in.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that in Challengers, the way he shot that tennis court, and his DP, who we'll talk about today, shot that tennis court in those matches that felt like you were watching 3 people kind of go back and forth in their like sexual conflict with one another or sensual conflict with one another. And then in Queer, you're watching this kind of like this major narrative of 2 men who are unraveling, as we're saying, but they're also like searching for connection. They're searching for love and are trying to be seen, and sometimes by one another or sometimes by their environment or other people within that and their surroundings. And so the design of this world is in conversation with the narrative, which is something I always appreciate. And it's something that I think, critics and audiences, we maybe take for granted with great filmmakers like this, who can use the tools of cinema to be in the same style or tone or in conversation with the script and the dialogue or the storytelling of the movie. And that really is like kind of the perfect blend of movie making for me. And I think Queer has that. Now, some people might think that the set design and all those things are superficial if you're not invested in the story. So I was already invested in the story by the time we started getting these exterior shots of miniatures.
Yeah.
So I think I put my head over to you for a second and was like, is that a miniature? When we first got the overhead shot of like where they were living. And then as soon as we saw the highway with all the fake cars, whatever they did to make those, the molds of them, I was like, oh wow, this is a really impressive, craftsmanship movie. So love the production design. And also the DP, like I said, Sayambu Muktipram, who has worked with Luca since Call Me By Your Name, does a really interesting thing where he like fragments the cinematography, where we get these intense pans, these insert shots where we see Allerton, our lead character or second lead character, kind of walk into Daniel Craig's room and look around at different things around the room to really understand who this guy is, because they're both kind of investigating one another, except you have one guy who's much more like external, the other one's much more internal. And so that was fascinating. We get a lot of surreal shots, as you're saying, some hazy imagery, a lot of cinematography and editing choices that are echoing the instability of the lead characters with some really bold choices. You mentioned Powell and Pressburger. I also thought about Thelma Schoonmaker a lot. I think Martin Scorsese and Thelma Schoonmaker are people that Luca brings up a lot in his interviews because he loves the editing style of those two.
Yeah.
And I felt that in this movie. I also love the score by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, who had the best score of the year in Challengers.
Yeah, and I love that they did something different here. It was
very different.
More emotional, right? Obviously, like Challengers was a sports movie, so it was way more upbeat. But I think I'm just like continuously impressed by what they're able to do and change up these different like electronic kind of sounding. They're just like very unique.
Yeah.
In the world.
Yeah. Sometimes can be like club music. Sometimes can be lo-fi. I would say this is more the latter in Queer. I also loved how they blended their electric tones with the actual soundtrack of the movie that doesn't care about using 1950s classical music. It actually uses more modern music. We have a lot of not needle drops necessarily, but let's just say non-diegetic music that's in conversation with the character arcs from Nirvana, from Prince. I think the movie opens with a Sinead O'Connor cover of a Nirvana song, and we're seeing like different totems or artifacts from
like
the journey of Lee and
Allerton. I always love how Luca decides to open up his films. I just like kind of putting us in a sense of place, like giving us different in like Call Me by Your Name. We have the different like statues that put us in the world. Here we're seeing like different items of clothing or just like belongings of the characters, which it just like I think thematically kind of gives us a second to settle in as well. And I also like just think the music was so interestingly used here, and I was worried when we were starting to get a lot of the kind of like songs opposed to like a score or opposed to like the Trent Reznor kind of like more instrumental. I was nervous that it was going to mess with the movie when we got the lyrical kind of songs, but actually I thought it added a lot.
And we'll get into this. I think that they use the non-diegetic actual soundtrack of the movie using songs from famous modern artists who are talking about what the movie is about in their music, like Nirvana and Prince. And I think that was successful. There was a few other artists as well, because when they use that non-diegetic music is usually when our lead character, Lee, is going through some kind of relapse moment of taking drugs. And so like, we're going to get into that. Okay, so let's get into the narrative. Like I was saying, Queer is, I think, one of Guadagnino's most ambitious movies, but I also think it's one of his most morally complex stories. So we're still taking this movie in. I wish we could have saw it twice before talking about it today. But I do think it is in conversation with like Call Me by Your Name, for example, or Bones and All, for being one of his more dense texts. And the performances match those themes. So let's start off with the character that we open up this movie with, Daniel Craig's Lee, who is going through a lot. He is struggling. You are trying to wonder how much of him is being destroyed by the culture around him that is homophobic, the dogma of his era, versus him being self-destructive with all the drug usage. You see his personality kind of, I guess, shaped by the era that he's living in, but the movie is not condescending to the audience. It doesn't spell everything out for you. You just kind of have to come in with this like expectation of knowing what the world was like at this time for gay men in particular. And you also have to read into like his new setting of living in Mexico City and what that means in terms of this movie being sympathetic of this character and what he's gone through, but also not necessarily judgmental of him, but it is making critical observations about him and his standing, which is fascinating right at the top. But he puts on at the top of this movie kind of an extroverted bravado, this kind of false sense of confidence that I think is hiding or disguising this kind of yearning for connection that we feel from his character throughout the rest of the film. Which again, like makes him this like challenging, but also sympathetic protagonist. He can be overwhelming in spaces in funny ways. He can like take up the air in spaces. We've talked about this on the Call Me by Your Name episode with the Oliver character, but this is an archetype that Luca Guadagnino comes back to, paralleling two characters who are dealing with something internally versus another character dealing with something externally. And so that's who we have with our lead character. Lee here is somebody who is really just taking up the room when he walks in.
Or like a Ray Fiennes character from A Bigger Splash.
That's a great example. Except I think that movie is way more critical of Ray Fiennes' character than this movie is of Lee. So Craig, I think, is wonderful in this. He gives one of the best performances of his career. He really weaponizes the audience's perception of who he is, the James Bond suaveness. To the
Which
point
is why Luca cast him.
That's right. That is why he cast him. Yeah, he thought it would be very smart to literalize like him wearing a gun on his, hip, and then also using this kind of like false sense of this cowboy masculinity to try to hide or disguise him being broken underneath the surface. And Daniel Craig's talked about making a shift in his career with Knives Out and Glass Onion and trying to get away from the playing in this tropey role of a hyper-masculine figure that maybe isn't even something that he wants to perpetuate in the culture, which, I mean, credit to him, that is a really like challenging thing to like branch off of, because most actors in this industry probably would lean more into that and find performances where they could just like be shooting it up in an action film. And Daniel Craig's like, no, I'm just going to work with Luca Guadagnino.
Yeah.
I also just love Daniel Craig and Rachel Weisz as a couple. So
Yeah.
I am biased, but
get Rachel Weisz in a Guadagnino movie.
Would love that. She would. She likes strange things. She's a Yorgos person.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would love that. Meanwhile, Drew Starkey, like we said, as the supporting character here, but really I think this is a co-lead, I would call it. We already said, but I think he's a revelation in this film. Guadagnino frames him as if he's a painting right away from that opening scene that we already brought up. A really intoxicating performance that, like I said, reminds me a little bit of a young Jude Law. I get young Marlon Brando, not in terms of like acting depth. We haven't gotten enough from him to say something like that, but just in terms of the aesthetics and like somebody knowing how they look too, which is a big deal. And yeah, Allerton, his character is subdued. He is mysterious. He's also destabilizing. He is kind of like exuding this allure, and he has all these physical gestures where you can't tell if he's making advances with Lee.
Yeah.
And this confuses Lee too. There's a moment where they first hang out and they're telling military war stories, whatever. And Allerton's smoking a cigarette. And then Lee's character, and this becomes like a visual motif of the movie, he has this disembodied ghost come out of him to reach out and touch Allerton on his shoulder.
Hand, right.
Yeah, well put, like a phantom hand. And this becomes like a recognition of the movie's themes or literalizing of it, where this character says throughout the film that I'm disembodied, I'm not queer. And we'll get into that more when Drew Starkey's character says that at the end of the movie. But I really love this moment, one, because you're so focused, you highlight that disembodied hand, that phantom hand. But also, if you look closely at what Allerton is doing when he's smoking a cigarette and putting it in his ashtray, like right over Lee's arm. And it's like raising the hairs on his arm. And there's small things like that where it is very confusing for Lee's character. He's like, what's going on here? Because of this homophobic era that they live in and that they came from the United States, where they feel more welcome in Mexico City, which we'll get to in a second, which is, the pros and cons of that choice from Luca's lens here politically. But it is fascinating nonetheless. And I think that Drew Starkey plays it with such a complexity that he's not getting a lot of credit for.
Yeah.
Jason Schwartzman is the other supporting character or actor in this movie, who plays I'm forgetting his character's name, but an eccentric friend to Lee, somebody who is like hilariously recounting their sexual escapades while highlighting the complex theme of what I was just saying, of this like neo-colonialism, where this man, they're finding levity in Schwartzman's character, but it's complicated. And I think we can talk about that now.
Yeah.
Lee's role in Mexico City kind of underscores, I think, the controversial part of this movie, where critics are kind of out on it, not just because they're emotionally distant, because that is true, but some critics have identified, and critics that we really love reading and listening to a lot, that this movie had a kind of ignorance to these white men in the story taking up the space of Mexico City. And I think it's more complex than that. And Luca always has, let's say, spicy politics in his movie, where he seemingly is coming off a little bit contrarian, but you can actually tell when examining the film, there is actually a much more kind of developed and examined point of view if you give the movie its due diligence, which we did with this film.
Yeah, and I think, like, you're right. I think what you're about to talk about, the Jason Schwartzman character, is kind of used in that way to touch on maybe a more complicated reading of like Lee and his friends.
Yes. So let's talk about Lee. So Lee is a gay white man living in the 1950s, unsure about his age, probably in his mid 40s. And he is a man discriminated by his own country during his dogmatic era of homophobia. But Lee is also a contradiction, because he is this representation of a kind of white flight, a white privilege of a white flight example here, where he escapes to Mexico City for safety without sacrificing his kind of like emotional, economic, or social status and stability. And that's really the part of the movie that I think some critics missed, which is that Guadagnino clearly is like shooting Lee and telling the story with a lot of sympathy for this figure in terms of the way that his sexuality has been criminalized by the wider world. But also there is a little bit of like self-hate that Lee has that you could perceive as him having this like internalized homophobia. But actually, I think it's more so this like form of neo-colonialism of these men kind of taking up the space of Mexico City, a place where they're only there because of a military campaign. And I think that's the unexamined part of this movie on the end of some critics who looked at it as maybe like an ignorant choice on Guadagnino's part to use these men to tell this story that seems kind of unaware of how these men inhabit this space. I think the scene that really makes it clear is with Omar Apollo's character in the beginning of the movie, where Lee has I think like a sexual interaction with Omar Apollo's character, where they go and have an intimate moment or intimate scene off screen, mostly, sometimes on screen, and Lee hesitates to give him money.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I read that was he didn't know, like, was this actually like an intimate interaction that was like sincere?
Right.
Or is this something that I need to like, was it a transaction?
Right.
And so like I viewed that more as him still feeling like in a state of like surveillance and anxiety around like or just like a fear, right, of violence,
right,
because like in terms of even like him being outside of the United States. So that's how I read that as well. But I guess I didn't really think about how that could be more so like a comment on what you're talking about in terms of like actually like complicating the Craig figure.
I think it's both, right? It's like Lee's character trying to figure out in the moment about whether or not he should pay this man because he doesn't want it to come off as a transactional experience. He's hoping that it can come off as an experience with this man of connection and love, of romance. And because he puts the money away, I think it also adds like a secondary commentary to the movie because he goes straight to taking drugs off screen. And we know he does because the motif for Lee taking drugs in this movie is the music, the non-diegetic music playing, which is later a discovery in the film where we see him, I think it might be heroin or something, where he is taking drugs and there's a long zoom out that's really tragic of him doing this and getting high, and the music starts playing. And we realize, oh, if you rewatch this movie, I'm sure when the music starts playing, when a scene starts, you're realizing off screen, Lee just took drugs.
Yeah.
And so that adds to the movie's tragedy of this character who is self-hating on multiple levels. But most of all, I think the thing that was missed, the point I'm just really trying to get across, is that I think there's enough subtextual provocations about this man just like regretting his like colonial space and taking over these people's lives and just navigating that and feeling horrible for it. And I think Schwartzman's character represents a sort of like ignorance to that, which is fascinating because Schwartzman plays that character with such levity.
Yeah.
He's so funny. But I think there is something underneath that levity. There is something that to reflect the privilege of these characters, the contradictions of these men in these military positions, first and foremost, outside of just them being queer, which the movie is going to explore for the second half of the film, clearly. But I think the first half of the movie is actually more about their role in Mexico City. Now, could we have gotten more about Omar Apollo's character? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he's a really good actor, and I would have loved to see that from him. But the heart of queer, and we can get into this more now, which is really the second half of the film, or the last hour and a half or so, is in Lee's pursuit of Allerton. Their dynamic, their relationship, what is it, is really the big question of the movie. And their dynamic, I think, blurs the line between this movie being about love or about obsession, and Lee's attempts to kind of understand Allerton's sexuality is a kind of serious, dramatic part of this movie that... I'm curious if you thought that was mostly what was going on. Like, did you think that Lee was like wondering for the entire runtime, is Allerton actually gay? Like, are we going to be in a relationship? Is he hiding something from me because of this era? Does he not feel safe? Does he not feel like he can communicate with me? Or, and I think this is the interesting part of the movie, is Allerton so repressed because of the era that he doesn't even know what he wants? And so the lack of communication on his part and his end, the mystery of the movie is actually the tragedy of the film, because we actually never hear from him. And that might be the more interesting thing to explore, because you are wondering, putting yourself in Allerton's shoes throughout the movie, because Starkey doesn't get much to say.
Yeah.
Is he just like going on this trip, which we're going to get to in a second, but a long trip in South America to different countries because it's a free trip? It's like a Talented Mr. Ripley situation. Yeah. Or is he going because he does have a connection, or he does yearn to connect with someone, and he possibly could want to be with this man and fall in love with him, but he doesn't feel like he has access to that at this point in his life. And I think that's where I wanted to ask you is like, what reading of the movie is more interesting to you when thinking back on it now? Because when you're in the movie, you're really in the POV of Lee.
Right.
And then when I leave it, I just can't stop thinking about Allerton in particular.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the movie is also aware of like the power dynamics, right? And so that also makes it a little bit more tricky. And that I think it's kind of both in terms of why Allerton decides to go on this like trip with Lee, right? I think Lee gives him access to like an emotional, right, relationship and path that we see explored during the like forest scene, right?
Yeah.
The ayahuasca like trip, where they're able to actually connect. But there are also elements, right, where Drew Starkey's character is literally like telling him to get away from him.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a power
he shoves him
dynamic
off him. Yeah.
there, that Luca is not, afraid to kind of like interrogate or to show us like a character who is complicated, like a Lee figure.
Right. Yeah. And I think that was probably the most interesting tension of the movie, which I guess we can go to now, which is that as Lee is trying to uncover the mystery of Allerton, it kind of culminates in him proposing this transactional trip to South America / romantic trip to South America. And the scene where we see this is Allerton preparing for chess with a woman that he's been with throughout the film,
right?
Which becomes this like brilliant metaphor when you're like re-examining the movie after you leave, because he's playing a game with a woman and then he actually like makes this like deal to go on this trip with a man. And so again, like the Luca speaking to what this person is going through internally is fascinating there, consciously or not. And as they journey through the different countries, Lee starts to spiral into withdrawal.
Yeah.
And I think we start to find evidence in these moments that Allerton actually does care for Lee and that it is a love story, because of Luca's movies, it's really hard to tell sometimes whether they're romances or like coming of age tragedies, you know, and he makes a lot of those, right? Of the latter. But I think this is actually one of his most romantic films, ironically, because many people are talking about it as a distant movie, a cold movie, something that they felt maybe was hollow. And I felt it to be really the opposite. I'm really treating the era that these men are in very seriously. Like I understand watching it, like why there's a lack of communication and why somebody might treat it as like a mystery more than a sad romance, which is more how I watch it. But yeah, I found this part of the movie to be incredibly satisfying, even though I think the pace was demanding for like the average person. That's why I was checking my phone, because I was curious if people like didn't care about Allerton, like would they even want to be in this movie anymore? Specifically when we start seeing Lee attempt to like get better, and then Allerton becomes like a cure for him, where he stays with him at night. We have that iconic image from the movie where his like leg caresses his leg. Or like when they go to the doctor and Allerton is explaining to the doctor what other symptoms Lee has. And there are these small moments where you really start getting a feel for what's going on underneath the surface with Allerton. And then we get the moment with, I think Lee, I went to the bathroom at this point, but Lee went to go and find out where to find the ayahuasca, right?
Right, yeah.
And
So
this is where the movie really provokes you about the pace, because it's about to go into the third chapter, which is starting a whole new sequence of the film, really, and a whole new area and geography, landscape. But it is taking its time right here. I remember this.
Yeah, well, I think that it's fascinating that when before I even saw it, I heard a lot of people say like, when we get into like the forest sequence, that is where it drags. That's what I heard a lot of people say or write about. And so I was fascinated that when this part of the movie was actually like happening, this was one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Interesting.
And again, I think it's because it has to do a lot with what Luca has tried to do and what he has done successfully in other movies, but like it felt like a culmination of a different thematic, threads that he's been trying to put together in his filmography. So I definitely want to talk about that in a minute, and also the surreal aspects of that I thought were really effective.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you went to the bathroom, basically he met with a guy who he was looking for this like drug, right? He was looking for something that he had read about, which becomes a part of the story thematically, but it's also like a literal part of the story where he talks about how it's able to create, right, like telepathy, you can, like talk to each other, right? And so that's something that's on the surface, but obviously like it is more so like, I want to talk to you without speaking, is what he says to Allerton's character right one night. And then this idea of connection is really like what he's searching for. But the man says like, be careful, it's not necessarily going to be something that I forget. It's not a portal or something he says, right? It's a mirror.
Yes, that is what he says. I what's funny about that sequence is like I kept just thinking. I don't know if you know anything about Aaron Rodgers. Maybe I won't even bring it up. Never mind. No, we'll touch on it.
Okay.
People know what I'm talking about. We're not going to get into it, but yeah. I mean, he wants this. He wants a portal into Allerton's mind because this is an asynchronous love story. That's what Luca Guadagnino calls it, and it's about two people falling in love, unraveling at the same time in different ways, in their own ways, but they're falling in love in different moments in their life. It is a Harry Met Sally, but Luca Guadagnino made it. You know what I mean? It is like, are these guys going to make it work? We unfortunately find out at the end of this film, they had this experience together. So who says that, you know, it didn't work, but they don't actually end up, you know, staying together for their life. But yeah, we could talk about your favorite part of the movie now, which is that there is a surrealism, there is a withdrawal, there's a disembodiment going on in the last 40 minutes of this film. The latter half really gets druggy, right? It's disorienting. And Guadagnino immerses us in his psyche with this surreal imagery. We see in nightmare sequences, disembodied woman. We see self-eating snakes. We see Lee's fragmented hallucinations of Allerton or people that he loves or is friends with in jail, prison outfits. And we get that kind of, again, that drug sequence too, where we start realizing, oh, when the music is playing, Lee just took drugs. So there's a lot you discover about the character and what's been going on for an hour and a half in the latter half of this movie. So the forest sequence, one of the most surreal sequences of any movie I've seen in 2024, involves Leslie Manville as a doctor who is unrecognizable in this movie. And she creates this ayahuasca-like drug. We start getting the Cronenberg Lynch inspired visuals where they take the drugs and the characters start vomiting.
Throw up their heart.
Organs, heart. Is that a heart? Is that what it is?
So.
Okay, yeah. And they start to merge.
Right.
And this has been a part of the Luca Guadagnino project. He's been using, you know, when Elio and Oliver say each other's name and Call Me By Your Name, that's supposed to be their secret language together to be out in public with one another in this like fascist, you know, bigoted time during the 1980s of Italy. But also it's a part of Luca's he wants to like strive for connecting the human spirit between two people who care for one another.
Yeah.
And it feels almost spiritual the way he shoots it. He was recently asked about how it, whether or not he intended it to be a surreal sex scene. And he said, I didn't see it like that at all.
Interesting. I didn't see it like that.
I didn't see it like that either.
Yeah.
But the interviewer was like convinced. Like he thought like that's exactly what it was, which is cool because obviously it's art, right? And this is an art piece. So like people are going to have different interpretations. And Luca thought that was fascinating. But
I thought mainly because he kind of already had like there was another scene, right? Like previously in their trip that was an actual sex scene.
Yeah, we had a few. Yeah,
which, you know, we have a lot of like complicated power dynamics also in that sequence of the movie.
Yeah.
But when we get to the trip, right, where they're like literally connecting, like it is almost like their bodies are merging. I thought it was like one of the most beautiful uses of CGI I've ever seen. Like thematically, and also like what you're talking about in terms of how Luca Guadagnino always explores like different feelings of like actual connection, even if it's between like a Tilda Swinton and a Ralph Fiennes character or something, right? This like tether that it reminded me of with each other.
A live action Studio Ghibli movie for adults. You know what I mean? Like in that moment where I was like,
a really
this is
surreal,
fascinating.
But like was able to accomplish what he was going for thematically like so well that it was I was just so surprised that people were so out on it.
Yeah, me too.
Because I thought it was like the most beautiful sequence of the movie. And also I think it encapsulates a lot of like what it feels like to kind of like we was talking about, like talk to someone without speaking or to feel connected to someone, especially during this really like complicated emotional time that like you're talking about this asynchronous love story of like not meeting up at the right time.
Right. I should also go back on what I just said. Studio Ghibli is not just for kids, but I meant directed at children. Okay. So basically Guadagnino had the challenging job, which is to end the Burroughs novel, because Burroughs it's an unfinished novel. And you can look into his life if you'd like. It's he has a very challenging end to his life, and he never got to finish this novel. But he kind of translates the fragmented storytelling in that book into this hallucinatory cinematic language here because this is not in the novel. And then it culminates in that merging of the two spirits of these two individuals. And then we get the end of the sequence by Starkey's character finally showing emotion. He sheds a tear. And this is what got me. Because I was wondering this whole movie, I was like, is this going to be like a 5-star classic for me? Like, this is a banger. I was like, the only thing I need right now is some emotionality because I am feeling a little bit stiff. Like, I could feel it about an hour and 45 into the movie. And as soon as Allerton, lets out a tear and he says, I'm not queer, I'm disembodied. And this lack of self that he was revealing to Daniel Craig's character, it won me over because I was like, wow, is very profound to get it at that specific moment after this like connection they just had that was ethereal, right? And so it hits you even more the next morning when he wants to go separate ways, to then Lee literally losing him in the forest.
Right.
And figuratively. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like almost connecting around like this feeling of not being able to express like a part of themselves. And so like I think that's why I haven't read the novel, but I think like coming back to a lot of these different symbolic, almost like very literary type of images that we saw throughout the movie. I was fascinated that also those images didn't bother me in terms of thinking about like, oh, there's I don't know, like that I maybe in other stories it would feel forced.
Sure.
Or it would feel like this is something that is literary. It's like a symbol being like put into. I
know what you
felt
mean.
like in Queer, I was really not trying to intellectualize a lot of what I was seeing in terms of like symbols. I was more so just emotionally like recognizing them as a part of like the thematic story that was going on, where I didn't have to say like, oh, this is exactly what this means.
Yeah.
But I was responding to it.
We were swept up in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were immersed
Which
in
I
it.
think is like the most successful way to incorporate like or adapt like a text into a film.
Yeah, and I think that's like something that I found to be powerful, especially as like to be watching this movie, to be immersed into it. Like that's the power of cinematic storytelling and what Luca can do to kind of like provoke all audiences in this way. There was something universal about how he told this story because, he also talks about in interviews, he wanted to use queer as a way to talk to all audiences, to find something that is universal about being othered in particular. He really used that word a lot in interviews, and he talked about how people, not just as sexuality being this kind of state of living outside of societal norms, but he wanted to talk about queerness, specifically, I think, with Allerton's character as somebody who is like, who refuses to conform or is conforming and has this like regret or this self-hate because of it. And the criminalization of those who don't conform is something that Luca really explores in his environments of his movies. They're always characters. There's like an authoritarianism going on in so many of his films, especially fascism, like Suspiria and Call Me by Your Name and Bones and All with Reagan. There's always a like kind of political turmoil in the background of his movies that is making these characters do things they wouldn't otherwise do or be wallflowers in situations they wouldn't otherwise be in those moments. And I thought he had really hit his peak with this in Bones and All. I was like, wow, he really did something special here about using cannibalism to literalize these metaphors he's so fascinated by or these real life struggles that he's so interested in. But this
was also an adapted novel, right?
It was.
Kajanic.
Yeah, Kajanic. We talked to him on the podcast. That was a beautiful conversation. But okay, we can get to the final scene now and today's episode. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope people go and watch this movie. There isn't really a reason for us to discuss this film on a podcast because we're not going to find a lot of new listeners from this movie because it just is not done well commercially. But we both walked away from it thinking there's no way we can end the year of 2024 now going into 2025 and not talk about this movie. It's that dense. So I really hope that if people have stayed this long without watching the movie that they rent it or buy it at home this week. So in the final moments of this movie, like I said, Lee loses Allerton both literally and metaphorically. And it's really a heart-stopping, for me at least, scene where Lee is shot into space.
Yeah.
I've never seen Luca do anything like this.
It was so disorienting, but I loved it.
Maybe outside of like having the devil appear in one of his films, which I don't want to spoil, but like I don't really, or a devil adjacent figure. I've never seen him take this kind of bold narrative liberty or visual liberty before of doing something this epic to me. And Lee goes back to where he was, Mexico City, see Schwartzman's character. We get some funny dialogue there about how he looks, and it's Daniel Craig, so he's beautiful, but like he does look worse for wear sometimes in this movie. And he's kind of wearing the haircut of Allerton in an interesting fashion. At least that was my observation. And then Lee basically reflects on his inability to hold on to Allerton. And then we see, I think we cut away to Lee's passing, right? He's so old in the future now. And
he's in the same room that we kind of opened the...
Is it the same room? Okay, wow.
Beginning of the movie with. And also we have that sequence, which I thought was really interesting, of him kind of like looking into his life.
Yeah.
Literally,
that was cool.
Like his eyeball is in the window, right?
Yes.
Of the miniature of that building.
Right.
As he walks into the room. And then you're right, we have that kind of like, instead of the phantom hand of Daniel Craig's character trying to reach out to Allerton, we have the phantom leg, right? Of the scene before of like the Drew Starkey character.
Yes.
This was the only, we might disagree, but this was the only place where I felt a little bit of the pacing. I wish it was just like a minute shorter.
What place in particular? Here. The dream sequence or the final moment?
The final moments, not the dream sequence. I thought the dream sequence was fascinating, especially, I mean, with the end of him like shooting Drew Starkey's character in the head, which apparently the actual author shot his wife in the head in the
Burroughs,
same way with like a shot glass.
It was a party game turned wrong. Yeah. So turned bad.
Yeah. So, but I thought that was like really, in terms of like the relationship between the characters, just kind of like devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And the end did work for me, this like kind of epilogue. But just the last moments with Lee in bed, I just wanted a tiny bit shorter, because I was already, and maybe it was the front row, maybe it was being in the front row and like kind of feeling the end of the movie.
The pace of it.
Yeah, I wish it had kind of wrapped up just it's a very small critique, but just like a minute shorter.
I mean, I was just, sometimes when you're in a movie, like I'm a big crier at movies, but sometimes like I'm frozen because I was so emotionally hit by a film. And this was one of those moments where when the disembodied, the phantom leg, as you said, like kind of pops up on screen, I was like, oh, wow. He just like, I'm assuming Daniel Craig's character just went through his whole life longing and feeling rejected. Yeah. And now his life is over. And there is something...
And feeling alone because of like societal, right, like circumstances. And,
right.
Yeah.
Yes. I hopefully we've like established that. But like there is a part of me going... Also, at the same time, this is the Luca project, but there is something beautiful about this experience he had with this person, where he traveled South America with this guy, and they saw one another in different moments at different points in time, and they didn't see each other in different points in time too. And I don't want to go in any further and over-explaining what we think about the movie because I don't want to be repetitive, but ultimately I was just really impressed by like how both surreal, beautiful, but also haunting this was as a romantic epic. Those are really hard tones to balance, and I think Luca did it. This team did it. This is obviously took dozens, if not hundreds of artists to work on because of what this movie looks like. So it's a real like filmmaking accomplishment. And I'm really trying to like say that a lot because it made like a few $1 million and it had an almost $50 million budget.
Yeah.
And that is not good. And I don't mean that's not good for the studio. I don't care about Amazon. I'm saying it's not good for movies like this in the future to be made. And you want to see movies like this be made. This is such a unique film about a queer experience, but also an experience of like otherness and a movie with like neo-colonial ideas in the periphery of the film. Like this is a really like provocative film and an adaptation of a challenging novel that otherwise would have never been made if it wasn't for Luca going out there and making one of the funniest romantic comedies of the last 10 years and challengers. And we're going to keep calling it a romantic comedy because that is what it is. But okay, extra credit. What do you have for Queer?
I think I really loved the production design, but I think I'm just going to go with, because I haven't really heard this movie being talked about in this way, but what we've already hit on today is this idea of like Luca finally reaching this like moment of what he's thematically explored, which is like people seeing each other. Like he's really interested in that. He's interested in like complicated, complex characters, looking at like, the historical like time periods that are also like constraints, but he's also really interested in people just like seeing each other and connection. And I think he captured that so well in this like last sequence of this trip. And I guess I want to give it extra credit just because I've I've sensed or heard that people were out on it. But I actually think it is the most successful part of the movie.
No, I agree. I think the storytelling has so many different lanes in this movie, but that one in particular is like one of the biggest feats of the film. I think, visually, I love the movie's artificiality. I love the way it's not afraid of it. But my extra credit goes to Allerton's character.
Yeah.
Not just Starkey's performance, but just like I think the character is so fascinating. I reminded me a lot of so many different characters in different movies that we've seen over the years, of coming of age stories in particular. He reminded me a lot of Logan Lerman's character in Perks of Being a Wallflower. There's a lot of characters like this that feel like they need somebody to empower them, and that really felt like what Daniel Craig's Lee was trying to do, attempted to do, but was already so gone because of this era. And so, he's self-medicating to such a degree where he was losing himself in the middle of his nights. He really couldn't do it. And so that was what was so tragic about their relationship or their dynamic. But I love Allerton's character. And he feels like endlessly interesting to talk about. And there's enough symbolism in this movie for a lot of video essays to be made that we missed on today. I think the last...
I'll watch them, yeah.
And I'll watch. I think the last thing I'll give extra credit to is the opening of the movie, which we already touched on, but Sinead O'Connor's cover over the different artifacts that Allerton and Lee get throughout their life together. I would love to rewatch that opening. I thought it was beautiful. I love the paint marks of queer in purple or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. But like, I think it's
it's
purple.
like a paint splatter kind of,
Sure. Yeah.
font.
And yeah, I just love the tone of the film. There's so many things I love about this movie, so I'll stop. That was the extra credits of Luca Guadagnino's Queer. We'll be back soon with probably The Brutalist, one of the most impressive movies of 2024, according to many people. Maybe not us. We'll see.
Yes. And then we also have Call Me By Your Name on Patreon right now, and Moonlight coming up.
Yeah, we're running a special Timmy program on Patreon right now, Chalamet, because it's a special time for him as one of our rising stars of our generation. But we're giving away a free episode on Patreon to free members. So if you go in the description of this episode, you should find our Patreon, the extra credits, plus where you can subscribe as a free member and have access to our 4-hour plus deep dive on Dune, which is Chalamet's probably most iconic role, though maybe not his most important role, which is Call Me By Your Name, which is what we just did, though that's behind the paywall, which is $5 a month.
And we did a ranking, too, for Timothée Chalamet's career and Luca Guadagnino's career on the Call Me By Your Name episode.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting where we put Dune 1, but it was like lower than expected.
We had a debate about both Dunes.
I think that was like our,
and Beautiful Boy and Call Me By Your Name. Yes, certainly. All right, guys. See ya.
Bye.